Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back into the world of the 17th century. Not the polished portraits you see in museums, but the real living story of George Washington, a man who was more than just a face on the dollar bill. He was a soldier, a farmer, and eventually, the reluctant first president of a brand new nation. If you're enjoying these journeys through history, a quick like or subscribe really helps keep this project going. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city or country, and maybe even the time right now where you are. It's always amazing to see how this community spans across the globe. So, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable spot, maybe turn on the fan to set the mood. And let's drift together into the world of George Washington. Tonight, we begin with a chapter of his life that shaped not only a man, but an entire nation. Commander of the Continental Army. In the late spring of 1775, the 13 colonies trembled at the threshold of something vast and uncertain. Skirmishes at Lexington and Concord had ignited sparks that now smoldered across New England. Farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants had rushed from their villages, muskets in hand, to form a ragtag force surrounding Boston. The British, entrenched in the city, faced an army of volunteers, spirited, yet without structure. It was in this uncertain moment that George Washington was called forward, summoned by the Continental Congress to lead an army not yet fully born. Washington's appointment as commander-in-chief was not a decision taken lightly. His years of service during the French and Indian War gave him experience, but not the polished reputation of a European general. What he possessed instead was a commanding presence, a quiet strength, and a reputation for dignity and resolve. When he arrived at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, tall and solemn in his Virginian uniform of blue and buff, delegates noted not only his appearance but the aura of leadership he carried with him. Soft creaking of wooden floors, murmurs of a distant gathering, faint scratching of quills on parchment. On June 15, 1775, Washington was formally chosen to command the Continental Army. He accepted the position with humility, refusing any salary beyond expenses. To those gathered, he remarked in calm sincerity, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." Yet his very words conveyed the gravity of the moment, an acknowledgement that the colonies were entering a conflict not with scattered militias, but with a unified, though fragile, army. Washington's journey northward to assume command near Boston was marked with a blend of solemnity and anticipation. Villages turned out to greet him, men tipped their hats, women waved kerchiefs, and children gazed up at the tall Virginian astride his horse. Many hoped he would bring order where confusion reigned, that he would give this revolution its heartbeat and shape. When he arrived at Cambridge in July, the scene before him was sobering. The men encamped around Boston were spirited, but discipline was scarce. Tents were improvised, muskets varied in quality, and supplies were uncertain at best. Each colony had sent its own bands of volunteers, fiercely loyal to their local commanders, less inclined to yield to authority from afar. Washington understood at once that before this army could face Britain's professional redcoats, it had to be made into a single body, drilled in patience, obedience, and endurance. Distant drumming, faint murmurs of campfires, neighing of horses, canvas flapping in the wind. He moved through the lines, observing not only the men, but their conditions. At night, the smoky air was filled with laughter and song, but also with coughing and unease. Disease was as dangerous as the enemy. Washington, meticulous in his habits, sought cleanliness and order, insisting on camp sanitation and better organization. His presence, calm yet firm, began to instill a quiet respect. Soldiers looked to him and saw not a man of fiery speeches, but of steady determination. The siege of Boston would be Washington's first test. The British held the city, supplied by the sea, while colonial forces encircled them on land. For months there was little movement, a standoff punctuated by occasional skirmishes. Washington's challenge was twofold: to keep his army intact through the long, uncertain wait and to prepare for an eventual strike. He urged Congress for powder, muskets, and supplies, writing with frustration that his men had not enough to powder a goose. Yet he concealed his army's weakness from the enemy, carefully projecting strength. Imagine a man who led a fledgling nation through its most perilous moments, a figure whose courage and vision laid the foundation of the United States. He was a soldier, a statesman, and a symbol of perseverance, yet behind the legend was a man with doubts, struggles, and choices that shaped history forever. This is the story of George Washington, the first president, the reluctant hero, and the father of a nation. Gentle introduction to early Virginia. In the soft, rolling hills of colonial Virginia, in the year 1732, a boy was born into the warm light of a new morning. The Washington family home at Pope's Creek lay nestled among gentle fields, with trees stretching their limbs toward the sky and the faint scent of the Potomac River drifting through the air. The world was quiet here, save for the chirping of birds, the occasional lowing of cows, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. George Washington, the eldest son of Augustine and Mary Washington, arrived into this world with no idea of the life that lay ahead. From the very first moments of his life, George was surrounded by a sense of calm routine. Days passed gently, guided by the rhythms of farm work and family care. The family home was filled with simple, measured sounds: the clatter of wooden cups on a table, the crackle of fire in the hearth, the gentle steps of servants moving through the corridors. These early impressions, quiet and unassuming, would lay the foundation for a man who valued steadiness, observation, and reflection. Childhood curiosity and discovery. As he grew, George became known for his curiosity. He wandered through the surrounding fields, observing the patterns of animals, the changing seasons, and the flow of the nearby river. He learned the value of patience from the planting of crops, watching tiny seeds grow into green stalks that swayed with the wind. Even in play, he noticed details others overlooked: the flight of a bird, the texture of bark under his fingertips, or the way sunlight filtered through the trees in the late afternoon. Education at home was informal but intentional. Augustine Washington encouraged young George to read and write, while Mary instilled in him a quiet discipline and respect for the natural world. Lessons often came in the form of stories by candlelight or gentle instruction while walking the farm paths. Numbers were learned alongside the rhythm of chores, and letters were written with care, each stroke deliberate and thoughtful. These lessons, often unnoticed at the time, were quietly shaping a keen mind and a measured temperament. Daily life at Ferry Farm. The daily life of young George was defined by simple tasks. Mornings began early with the rising sun. He would help tend the livestock, feed chickens, and check on the crops. Afternoons often found him with paper and ink, learning to sketch maps of the surrounding land or copying letters from books. Play and work blended seamlessly, as chores offered opportunities for learning, and small adventures offered moments of joy. Evenings were calm. The family would gather near the hearth, where the soft glow of the fire painted the room in warm hues. Stories were shared, tales of distant lands, of family history, or of lessons learned long ago. Here, George absorbed not just knowledge, but a sense of place, an understanding of continuity, and the comforting cadence of family life. Early lessons in responsibility. From a young age, George was entrusted with responsibility. He was often sent on errands, entrusted to care for younger siblings, or asked to manage small aspects of the household. Each task, though small, nurtured a sense of duty and attentiveness. Mistakes were treated gently, as opportunities to learn rather than moments to scold. The rhythm of responsibility and reward, patience and observation, instilled in him a quiet confidence that would carry into his later life. Even his interactions with the local community were instructive. Visiting neighbors, Attending local gatherings and observing the workings of nearby farms offered George glimpses of society beyond his immediate home. He learned early the value of courtesy, observation, and understanding others, traits that would serve him well in times of leadership. Formative experiences and gentle adventure. The boyhood of George Washington was marked by gentle adventure. Days were spent exploring streams and woods, climbing small hills, and imagining distant places he had heard about in stories. He kept journals, noting the behavior of birds or the shapes of clouds. These exercises were not merely pastimes. They were early studies in observation and reflection. Even the tools he used became instruments of learning. A surveying compass, a small set of books, and carefully kept notes allowed George to blend curiosity with methodical thinking. The quiet practice of recording observations and mapping the land cultivated an attentive mind, one that noticed detail without hurry and appreciated the subtle rhythms of the natural world. Soft reflections on family and home. As years passed, the Washington household continued to be a place of calm guidance. Augustine's practical knowledge and Mary's gentle care combined to provide George with a balanced upbringing. Family rituals, shared meals, Sunday walks, tending the garden, created a world that was predictable yet rich with small delights. It was within this environment of quiet structure that George learned to value patience, observation, and steadiness. These qualities, nurtured in the calm of colonial Virginia, would later inform his decisions, his leadership style, and the measured way in which he approached challenges. Looking toward the future. Though the horizon of his life stretched far beyond these gentle beginnings, George's formative years were never hurried. Each moment, each small responsibility, and each quiet observation contributed to a foundation that was as sturdy as the hills surrounding Ferry Farm. As we leave young George wandering the fields in the fading light of day, it is worth imagining the soft wind, the distant call of birds, and the gentle rustle of trees, the subtle companions of a boy who would one day leave a mark on history. The early life of George Washington, when observed slowly and quietly, is a reminder that greatness often grows in stillness, nurtured by patience, reflection, and the calm rhythm of daily life. Exploring the land. George Washington's teenage years and surveying the gentle shift to adolescence. As George grew from a curious boy into a thoughtful young teenager, the landscapes of Virginia remained his constant companion. The rolling hills, quiet forests, and the soft murmur of rivers provided a canvas for learning, reflection, and the slow unfolding of his character. Each day was a gentle rhythm. Mornings in the fields, afternoons with pen and paper, evenings by the hearth, listening to family stories. There was little rush, only the steady pace of a life steeped in observation and contemplation. Teenage George became increasingly aware of his surroundings, noticing the subtleties of the natural world. The way sunlight played through branches, the distant flight of a hawk, or the gentle ripple of water over stones in a creek. These quiet observations were mirrored in the care he gave to his studies and the attentiveness with which he undertook each small responsibility. Lessons in discipline and responsibility. During these years, George's sense of duty deepened. He helped manage aspects of the family farm and occasionally assisted with the oversight of neighboring lands. Each task, whether simple or intricate, taught him patience, precision, and the value of consistent effort. Mistakes were not met with harsh reprimand, but with gentle guidance, nurturing a quiet confidence that would prove invaluable later in life. Letters from mentors and family members emphasized virtues such as honesty, diligence, and thoughtful reflection. George's early correspondence reveals a young man learning to express himself carefully, choosing words with deliberation, and appreciating the steady rhythm of everyday life. Early curiosity about the wider world. Though the Virginia countryside was his home, George's mind often wandered to distant places. Maps, Letters from acquaintances and stories of far-off settlements ignited a gentle curiosity about the wider world. These thoughts were never hurried or restless, but rather like soft ripples across a still pond, subtle, consistent, and slowly expanding his perspective. It was during these years that George first encountered the practice of surveying, measuring land, mapping forests and streams, and noting the features of the terrain combined his natural curiosity with disciplined observation. Each survey was an opportunity to move quietly through the land, noting its patterns and rhythms and recording them with careful precision. The art of surveying. Surveying became a kind of meditation for George. Armed with simple instruments, a compass, measuring chain, and notebook, he walked through forests, fields, and along the banks of rivers. Each measurement required attention, each observation, patience. The work was methodical, almost ceremonial, setting stakes, noting angles, sketching maps with precise lines, and recording the gentle inclinations of hills and valleys. As he matured, George's skill in surveying grew steadily. Local landowners took note of his reliability and meticulousness, trusting him with parcels of land that required careful assessment. Yet the work itself was quiet and calming. Each day in the open air, listening to the sounds of nature provided a soothing rhythm to his young life, moments of reflection and growth. Even as his responsibilities increased, George never lost the reflective quality of his childhood. He often paused during long walks in the forests to observe the small details of life around him. The way dew clung to a leaf, the songs of birds echoing through the canopy, the subtle shift in the wind. These moments nurtured a contemplative mind, one capable of weighing decisions carefully and appreciating the slow unfolding of events around him. In letters to his family, he wrote not only of measurements and maps, but also of the quiet pleasures he observed. A sunset over the river, the scent of freshly tilled soil, the laughter of children playing in distant fields. Such reflections were the early signs of a thoughtful leader, one attuned to both detail and the broader landscape of life, learning from mentors and experience. During his teenage years, George benefited from the guidance of several older mentors. They taught him the technical skills of surveying and navigation, but also offered advice on temperament, patience, and responsibility. These lessons were never delivered with urgency or pressure. Instead, they were soft, steady conversations during walks, over meals, or beside the fires of a quiet evening. He learned to balance ambition with calm, curiosity with care, and skill with mindfulness. Each day offered opportunities to practice these virtues, whether while measuring a stretch of land, assisting a neighbor, or quietly observing the natural world around him. Small adventures and exploration. Though much of his time was devoted to study and surveying, George also enjoyed gentle adventures. He would explore nearby streams, follow animal tracks through the woods, and climb small hills to survey distant views. These excursions were slow and deliberate, offering a sense of freedom and connection to the land. The quiet companionship of birds, rustling leaves, and distant streams provided a soft soundtrack to his explorations. It was in these moments that George honed a subtle blend of attentiveness and patience. He learned to notice patterns, anticipate changes in terrain, and record observations with careful accuracy. These experiences laid the groundwork for the calm, deliberate approach that would characterize his later military and political life. Gentle reflections on growth. By the end of his teenage years, George Washington had developed habits of attention, patience, and reflection. He combined curiosity about the world with a disciplined approach to tasks and a deep appreciation for the rhythms of daily life. Each map he drew, each field he measured, and each quiet moment spent observing the natural world contributed to the foundation of a thoughtful, measured young man. As we imagine him walking through Virginia forests at dusk, the soft orange light filtering through the trees, It is easy to picture the beginnings of a mind both attentive and serene, capable of careful thought and quiet leadership. These formative years were not marked by dramatic events, but by gentle growth, the steady, calming rhythm of observation, learning, and reflection. The story of George Washington's early military years begins not with gunfire, but with quiet anticipation. The Virginia frontier of the 1750s was a place of both opportunity and unease. Dense forests stretched endlessly, broken only by winding rivers and the occasional smoke of a distant cabin. The land was breathtaking in its scale, yet it carried the tension of competing empires. Britain and France both claimed these fertile valleys, while native peoples held ancestral ties to every ridge and stream. Into this world stepped a tall, reserved young man, George Washington, barely out of adolescence, yet destined to learn lessons of command, hardship, and restraint. In the soft light of morning, the air smelled of pine and earth. Birds chattered above while Washington, still in his late teens, studied maps and reports with the concentration of someone far older. He was eager, yet calm, drawn to the discipline of soldiering as though it were a calling. His earlier training as a surveyor had taught him how to read landscapes with precision, every bend of a river, every ridgeline, every clearing. These skills, honed in the wild forests of Virginia, would now prepare him for a different task: leading men. Gentle forest breeze, distant bird calls, the faint trickle of water from a nearby stream. When Washington first entered public service, it was not as a seasoned general, but as a young officer in Virginia's militia. At just 20 years old, he was appointed as a major, responsible for training and organizing volunteers. It was an enormous responsibility for someone of his age, but the colony's leaders saw in him a composure, discipline, and sense of duty uncommon in youth. Life in the militia was far from glamorous. The men were farmers, planters, and laborers who gathered when called, often without proper uniforms or weapons. Washington's role was to bring order, to teach drill, discipline, and the careful use of arms. Though strict in expectations, he was never cruel. He believed in respect, leading not by fear but by example. Those who served under him would later remember the calm firmness in his voice, the quiet way he earned their trust. In the evenings, after long days of training, Washington often sat near the fire with his fellow officers. The flames flickered against the canvas of their tents, and the crackling of wood mixed with low voices in conversation. Stories of campaigns in Europe drifted through the air, tales of strategy, siege, and glory. Washington listened more than he spoke. He was absorbing not only the discipline of arms, but also the culture of military life, the camaraderie, the rituals, and the quiet dignity of service. Low crackle of campfire, quiet murmur of voices, faint night wind through canvas. In 1753, as tensions rose between Britain and France in North America, Washington received a mission that would test his resolve. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia selected him for a delicate task: to travel deep into the Ohio country and deliver a message to the French commanders who had built forts there. They were to withdraw, for the land was claimed by Britain. The journey was long and fraught with danger. Snow lay heavy on the ground, and the rivers were frozen. Washington traveled with a small party that included native guides and frontiersmen. For weeks they trekked through the wilderness, crossing icy waters, pushing through forests where the only sounds were the crunch of snow and the distant call of wolves. At night, wrapped in his cloak beneath the stars, Washington wrote in his journal, his handwriting steady, his reflections precise. He recorded not only the geography of the land, but also the character of the people he met. When he finally reached the French fort, he delivered the governor's letter with calm courtesy. Though the French politely declined to leave, the mission was a success in another sense. Washington had proved himself. His endurance, courage, and composure under strain impressed his superiors. Word spread through Virginia that the young major had carried out his duty with distinction. Muffled crunch of boots on snow, faint howl of wolves in the distance, crack of frozen branches underfoot. The following year, Washington's military career deepened as conflict erupted into open war. France and Britain clashed over the Ohio Valley, and young officers like Washington were thrust into the forefront. He was ordered to lead men to reinforce a fort being built on the frontier. Yet before he arrived, the French had seized it, renaming it Fort Duquesne. In the tense days that followed, Washington commanded a small skirmish in the wilderness. Shots rang out in the forest shadows, and for the first time he experienced the confusion of battle, the smoke, the cries, the sudden stillness after violence. Though the clash was minor by European standards, it carried great weight. It marked the beginning of the French and Indian War, a conflict that would spread across continents. Washington's men hastily built a small wooden stockade, which he named Fort Necessity. It was a humble structure, barely more than a rough defense. When the French attacked, rain poured from the skies, soaking powder and turning the ground into mud. Surrounded and outnumbered, Washington was forced to surrender. It was a humbling moment, a reminder that eagerness alone could not win battles. Yet even in defeat, there was dignity. Washington negotiated terms that allowed his men to retreat honorably. Back in Virginia, rather than face scorn, he was praised for his bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. The experience deepened his resolve. He had tasted both command and failure, and from both he would learn. Distant rumble of thunder, heavy rain falling on wooden planks, muffled sounds of soldiers moving in mud. As the war widened, Washington served under the command of British generals. He learned from them, their strategies, their discipline, and their insistence on order. At the same time, he observed their flaws. He saw arrogance, rigidity, and a lack of understanding for the realities of colonial warfare. Washington adapted what was useful and quietly resolved to do better where they failed. He marched with British troops along wilderness roads, cutting through forests where every mile demanded sweat and labor. He saw columns of red-coated soldiers stretching for hours, their drums echoing through the trees. He watched as supply wagons broke wheels in the mud, as weary men slumped against their muskets, and yet the march continued. These impressions would never leave him. They taught him the immense challenge of logistics, the unforgiving demands of campaign life. At night, under the canopy of stars, Washington reflected on the path unfolding before him. He had entered the militia as a young man eager for adventure, but now he felt the weight of something greater. Soldiering was not about glory. It was about endurance, responsibility, and the quiet burden of leadership. Rhythmic march of drums, faint clatter of wagon wheels, wind rustling leaves above the marching column. By his early 20s, George Washington was no longer merely a young Virginian planter. He had become a soldier marked by both ambition and humility. The forests had tested him, the snow had chilled him, and battle had scarred him. Yet through it all, his character was deepened by patience, by dignity, and by an unshakable sense of duty. He would return from these early campaigns with knowledge written not only in his journals, but also in his very bearing. The calmness in his eyes, the measured tone of his words, the quiet strength in his posture, all were the signs of a man being shaped for far greater challenges to come. And as the fire crackled one last time in a Virginia encampment, the young officer sat in silence, his gaze on the horizon. The war was far from over, but already Washington was becoming more than a soldier. He was becoming a leader. Soft campfire, crickets at night, distant hoot of an owl in the darkness. The French and Indian War. The year was 1754, and the air in the Ohio River Valley carried a strange weight, part promise, part danger. The land was rich with forests, rivers, and fertile ground, claimed by many but truly belonging to none. French traders, British settlers, and native nations all laid competing stakes upon it. Yet, it was in this contested wilderness that a young George Washington, barely 22 years old, began to step into the role that would shape his destiny. Soft rustling of leaves, a faint creek flowing in the background, occasional distant bird calls. Washington was not yet the man of marble statues or revered portraits. He was still finding his place in the world, an ambitious young officer with little formal training, a steady hand, and an eagerness to prove himself. The French and Indian War, as it would come to be called, was the first true test of his courage and resilience. It was a conflict that stretched far beyond the backwoods of America, reaching across the oceans to embroil the great powers of Europe. But for Washington, it began in the quiet shadows of Virginia's forests. The Ohio Country. The Ohio Country, vast, fertile, and strategically vital, was the heart of the struggle. To the British colonies, it promised expansion westward, new lands for settlement and trade. To the French, it was the lifeline connecting their territories from Canada down to Louisiana. To the native nations, it was home, a land of deep ancestral meaning, rivers rich in fish, and hunting grounds filled with deer and bison. Washington, then a major in the Virginia militia, received orders from Governor Robert Dinwiddie. His task was daunting: deliver a message to the French commanders, demanding they vacate British-claimed territory. This mission would send him deep into unfamiliar terrain, through bitter cold, swollen rivers, and vast forests. Crunch of footsteps over frost, faint wind whistling through bare trees. Despite his youth, Washington accepted without hesitation. He gathered a small company of frontiersmen and native guides and set out into the wilderness. The journey tested him physically and mentally. One night, after a heavy snow, his coat froze stiff upon his shoulders. Another time, he nearly drowned when an ice-laden river forced him into the freezing current. And yet, he pressed on, his determination unbroken. When he finally arrived at the French post at Fort Le Boeuf, Washington presented the governor's letter. The French commander, polite but firm, refused. The French would not yield their claim. Washington returned with this answer, and though his mission failed diplomatically, his endurance and detailed reports impressed those who read them. His star began to rise. The spark of war. The following spring, Washington was sent once more to the frontier, this time with soldiers. Tension in the Ohio Valley had reached a breaking point. Skirmishes between native allies of both empires had already begun. Now, the British colonies and the French prepared for open war. Washington and his men advanced cautiously through the thick woods, accompanied by Tanacharison, a leader of the Mingo people, often called the Half-King. It was he who informed Washington of a small French detachment camped nearby. With surprise on their side, Washington and his militia struck. The clash at Jumonville Glen was brief but bloody. Shots rang out through the forest, echoing across the trees. Several French soldiers fell, including their leader, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Washington would later write of the event with restraint, yet the incident ignited a fire he could not control. France claimed that Washington had ordered an assassination while Britain declared it a defensive act. Either way, blood had been spilled and war had begun. Sharp crack of distant musket fire fading into silence, then replaced by the soft patter of rain on leaves. For Washington, the reality of war now revealed itself, not as the glory he may have imagined, but as chaos, confusion, and consequence. Fort necessity. The French, swift in retaliation, advanced with force. Washington, realizing his small militia was exposed, ordered the construction of a crude fortification in a low meadow. The place came to be called Fort Necessity. It was little more than a circular palisade of logs, surrounded by trenches hastily dug in the rain-soaked ground. On July 3, 1754, French troops and their native allies descended upon the position. Sheets of rain turned the ground to mud, water filled the trenches, and Washington's men fired from soggy powder. For hours they held, muskets cracking in the downpour, but as night fell, it was clear they were outmatched. In the darkness, Washington agreed to surrender. The French, magnanimous in victory, allowed him and his men to return home. Yet, in signing the Articles of Capitulation, Washington unknowingly admitted to the assassination of Jumonville. The French seized upon this as propaganda. Heavy rain mingling with muffled thunder, distant shouts fading into silence. Though defeated, Washington carried lessons that would shape him for years. He learned the cost of poor preparation, the weight of command, and the sting of defeat. But perhaps most importantly, he discovered his own resilience. Though humbled, he was not broken. Growing reputation. Despite the failure at Fort Necessity, Washington's courage and steadiness under pressure caught attention. Soon, he found himself serving alongside the British Army under General Edward Braddock. Braddock's march into the wilderness would end in tragedy, but for Washington it was another crucible of experience. At the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, Braddock's forces were ambushed by French soldiers and native warriors. The scene was chaos, red-coated British regulars breaking ranks under the deadly precision of their enemy. Horses screamed, wagons overturned, smoke and confusion filled the forest. Through it all, Washington rode fearlessly, rallying men, carrying orders, and refusing to abandon the field. Musket balls tore through his coat. 2 horses were shot from beneath him, yet he remained unscathed. To many, it seemed Providence itself shielded him. His reputation grew, not just as a soldier, but as a man marked for destiny. Thundering hooves, shouted orders, then fading into quiet forest birdsong as the battle passes into memory. Lessons of war. For the next several years, Washington remained in military service. He fought in smaller campaigns, commanded troops along the frontier, and struggled with the frustrations of colonial military organization. He quarreled with British officers who dismissed colonial soldiers as inferior. He wrestled with shortages of supplies and the difficulties of defending long, wild frontiers. And yet, all these experiences hardened him. He learned discipline, strategy, and patience. He came to understand not just the brutality of war, but the necessity of preparation, unity, and leadership. By the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was no longer a young, untested officer. He was a seasoned commander, still ambitious, still restless, but tempered by trial. The wilderness had tested him with snow, rivers, mud, and musket fire, and he had emerged with scars, both seen and unseen. Soft crackling of a campfire, night crickets humming gently in the background. For Washington, the war was more than a chapter of youth. It was the forge that shaped the man who would one day lead a revolution. The valleys and forests of the Ohio country echoed with lessons that would resurface years later, when a new and greater struggle called him to stand once more at the forefront of history. The path to revolution. The war that had defined George Washington's early manhood, the French and Indian War, had ended. Britain emerged victorious, but victory brought with it new challenges. Washington, still in his 20s when the conflict closed, returned to Virginia not as a soldier, but as a man determined to carve out a life of prosperity, respect, and influence. He was not yet the figure of myth and legend. He was a man of flesh and blood, carrying the memories of battle, the scars of harsh winters, and the lessons of leadership both triumphant and humbling. The war had given him a reputation, yes, but not the fortune he sought. And so, in the quiet fields of Mount Vernon, the next chapter of his life began. Gentle rustle of leaves, bird song in the distance, the hum of insects on a summer afternoon, sounds of a Virginia plantation estate. A return to Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was no mere farmhouse. Overlooking the broad sweep of the Potomac River, it was both a home and a symbol. The land had been in the Washington family for generations, but under George's hand, it began to grow into something greater, a thriving plantation that demanded as much of his discipline as the battlefield ever had. Here, Washington learned the rhythms of agricultural life. He rose early, often before dawn, to walk the fields. He studied crop yields, experimented with rotations, and managed enslaved laborers whose toil underpinned the estate's prosperity. Tobacco had been the traditional crop of Virginia, but Washington, ever practical, recognized its depleting effects on the soil. He diversified, turning to wheat, corn, and livestock. This period of Washington's life is often overlooked, yet it was here that his vision matured. He was not simply a farmer. He was a man thinking in systems, a planner of grand scale. These same qualities would one day shape armies and governments. Soft creak of wooden doors opening at dawn, distant call of a rooster, faint sound of river water lapping against the shore. Marriage and stability. In 1759, George Washington's life changed in a profound way. That January, he married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. The union was one of both affection and practicality. Martha brought considerable wealth, land, enslaved workers, and social standing that elevated Washington's position in Virginia society. Washington stepped into the role of stepfather with a sense of duty. Though he never had children of his own, he cared for Martha's children as his own, guiding them with a steady, if somewhat stern, hand. With Martha, Washington found stability. Their marriage became the foundation upon which his public career would rest. Behind the scenes of history's great drama was a quiet domestic life. Evenings spent by the fireplace, conversations about crops and neighbors, letters written to friends, and the daily concerns of estate management. It was a life of comfort compared to the wilderness campaigns of the war, but the comfort was not destined to last. Crackling fire, faint voices of children at play in the distance, occasional neigh of horses from a nearby stable, rising tensions. Beyond the quiet of Mount Vernon, winds of change swept across the Atlantic. Britain, victorious in war, now faced staggering debts. The colonies, prosperous and growing, seemed a natural source of revenue. Parliament imposed new taxes and restrictions, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the infamous Stamp Act of 1765. Washington, like many Virginia planters, felt the sting of these measures. The taxes cut into his livelihood, but more than that, they struck at his sense of dignity. Colonists were taxed without representation in Parliament, treated less as free subjects and more as subordinates of the Crown. In letters and conversations, Washington's frustration grew. He was not yet calling for independence, that leap was still far off, but he, like his peers, began to question the fairness of Britain's policies. He joined in protests against the Stamp Act, supported non-importation agreements, and attended meetings where men debated the limits of imperial authority. What had once been loyalty to the Crown was slowly shifting. Washington, a man of order and discipline, did not rush to anger, yet he could not ignore the steady encroachment upon the rights of Virginians and all colonists. Faint murmur of voices in heated discussion, clink of tankards in a tavern, soft creak of quill on parchment as letters are written. A gentleman of Virginia, Washington's life in these years was not all politics. He also cultivated the image of a Virginia gentleman. He attended social gatherings, entertained guests at Mount Vernon, and served in the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial assembly. There, he was not a fiery orator but a steady presence, lending his voice and reputation to the growing chorus of dissent. The role of a gentleman carried with it certain expectations, duty to community, hospitality, and a sense of honor. Washington embraced these ideals, wearing tailored clothes from London, hosting elaborate dinners, and maintaining his estate as a showcase of refinement. Yet beneath the veneer of calm civility lay a man shaped by hardship, ambition, and an emerging sense of destiny. Distant strains of a harpsichord, soft laughter of guests at a dinner gathering, clinking of glasses in a large hall. The seeds of revolution. By the late 1760s and early 1770s, tensions had hardened into something deeper. The Townshend Acts, the Quartering Act, and finally the coercive acts following the Boston Tea Party, all fueled resentment. Washington watched events in New England with interest, sympathy, and growing alarm. He began to correspond more frequently with other colonial leaders, aligning himself with the idea that resistance was necessary. He saw Britain's military presence in the colonies not as a shield, but as a threat. Still, Washington did not call for separation. He hoped for reconciliation, a restoration of the rights colonists believed were theirs by birthright. But reconciliation was slipping further out of reach. The First Continental Congress of 1774 marked a turning point. Washington traveled to Philadelphia as one of Virginia's delegates. There, among men like John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams, he stepped into a larger stage. Though he spoke little, his presence carried weight. His military experience, reputation, and quiet authority made him a natural leader. The path was set. Washington had returned from war a soldier and built a life as a planter, husband, and statesman. But destiny was calling him back to service. Soon, he would be asked not only to resist Britain, but to lead a revolution. Soft sound of wagon wheels on cobblestones, murmur of voices in a crowded hall, distant tolling of a church bell in Philadelphia. In March of 1776, fortune turned. Henry Knox, a bookseller from Boston turned artillery commander, had managed an astonishing feat, hauling heavy cannons captured at Fort Ticonderoga across frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains to the outskirts of the city. Washington seized the moment. Under cover of darkness, his men fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. When the British awoke to see cannons looming above them, they realized the city could no longer be held. Within days, they evacuated by ship, sailing north to Halifax. Muffled footsteps in snow, distant rumble of wheels, the creak of heavy cannon on wooden sledges, fading into the soft call of gulls over water. This first victory was not a battle of grand charges or bloody fields. It was a triumph of resolve, patience, and cunning. Washington's ability to hold his army together, to mask weakness with confidence, and to seize opportunity when it appeared, marked the dawn of his command. Yet challenges only deepened as the war stretched on. In the summer of 1776, British fleets arrived in New York Harbor, great armadas of ships, their sails blotting the horizon. Against them, Washington's forces were untested, scattered, and few in number. The Battle of Long Island in August was a sobering defeat. Surrounded and nearly trapped, Washington orchestrated a nighttime retreat across the East River, ferrying his army to safety under cover of fog. It was a narrow escape, one that preserved the cause itself. Washington would write of these moments with measured tone, but inside he carried the weight of each loss, each retreat. His men suffered hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Supplies were scarce, pay uncertain, and desertions common. He faced not only the British, but also doubts from Congress and whispers among his own officers. Yet he pressed on, steady as the march of time. His leadership was not one of sudden glory, but of endurance, the quiet ability to hold together a fragile dream. Lapping of waves against wooden boats, low rumble of thunder in distance, hushed voices urging quiet, faint clinking of oars against water. Amid these struggles, Washington began to understand the nature of the war he commanded. It was not to be won in grand, decisive battles alone. It was a war of patience, of wearing down an empire across oceans, of sustaining belief among soldiers and civilians alike. Each retreat, each regrouping, was not a failure, but a step in a longer rhythm. Washington became not only a commander of armies, but a steward of hope. By the end of 1776, his army was dwindling, morale at its lowest ebb. Many feared the cause would dissolve with the coming winter, yet Washington was not finished. In December, he led his men across the icy Delaware River to strike at Trenton. The victory that followed would reignite the flame of the Revolution, but that is a tale to be carried into our next chapter. For now, we see him as he truly was, a commander not born of triumphs alone, but of burdens carried with dignity, defeats endured with patience, and moments of resolve that turned despair into endurance. George Washington, the Virginian planter who once rode through forests as a young provincial officer, now stood as the leader of a fledgling nation's army, an army held together by little more than his will. Gentle winter wind, soft crackle of a campfire, the distant roll of a drum fading into silence. Trials of war. The Revolution, like all human struggles, was not a steady march toward triumph. For George Washington, the years between 1776 and 1777 tested him in ways no earlier campaign could have foretold. They were years of retreat, of doubt, and of haunting uncertainty, when the fragile experiment of American independence seemed certain to collapse under the weight of British arms. Yet, through the storm of these trials, Washington's steadiness became the bedrock on which hope survived. We begin in the late summer of 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, its bold words ringing out across the colonies. The bells of Philadelphia had only just fallen silent when news came of Britain's vast military response. More than 3,000 soldiers, redcoats and German Hessian mercenaries assembled on the shores of Staten Island. The largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent across the ocean. They came with fleets of ships so numerous that, as one observer noted, they looked like forests of masts stretching to the horizon. Washington, standing with his officers in New York, gazed upon this sight. The young Republic's army, poorly trained, undersupplied, and numbering scarcely 2,000 men, would soon face the most powerful empire on earth. The odds were staggering. Distant rolling thunder, faint sound of waves lapping against ships' hulls, gulls crying in the air, carrying the weight of foreboding. The battle for New York. Washington knew the city of New York was vulnerable. Its deep harbors made it an ideal target for the British Navy. Yet politically and strategically, it was too important to abandon. To lose New York without a fight would be seen as cowardice. To defend it risked disaster. He chose to fight. In late August, the armies clashed on Long Island. The British swept forward with disciplined force, while Washington's men faltered. In the thick fog of battle, American lines broke, and confusion spread. At one desperate moment, the Maryland regiments, scarcely more than a few hundred strong, launched a counterattack that held the British at bay long enough for many comrades to retreat. Their sacrifice, remembered as the Maryland 400, was a glimpse of the courage that sustained the cause, even in defeat. When night fell, Washington faced ruin. His army was trapped, hemmed in by the British on one side and the sea on the other. Capture seemed inevitable. Yet, in one of the most remarkable escapes of the war, Washington organized a silent retreat across the East River. Under the cover of darkness, aided by a thick fog that rolled in as if summoned by fate, his soldiers slipped away in small boats. By dawn, the British awoke to find the American army gone, saved by secrecy, weather, and Washington's resolve. Soft lapping of oars in water, muffled whispers of soldiers, a low mist drifting through the night air. The retreat from Long Island marked not just a physical escape, but a symbolic one. The Revolution itself slipping through the grasp of certain destruction. A season of defeat. The following months were grim. The British pressed their advantage, pushing Washington's army from Manhattan, then across New Jersey. Each skirmish brought another retreat, another town abandoned. Supplies dwindled, morale broke, desertions spread like an illness. Congress fled Philadelphia in fear that the capital would be taken. Washington, in his letters, spoke with candor about his despair. "A cloud of darkness hangs heavy upon us," he wrote, his words heavy with exhaustion. For a time, it seemed the revolution itself had lost its momentum, the flame of liberty flickering against the storm. And yet, amid the darkness, Washington's presence mattered more than any battlefield victory. He rode with his men through mud and sleet. He shared in their hunger and their weariness. His calm, unyielding figure was itself a form of resistance, convincing the soldiers that if Washington had not abandoned the cause, neither could they. Cold winter wind, boots sloshing through mud, the distant creak of wagon wheels, faint murmurs of weary men. The crossing of the Delaware. By December of 1776, the American army seemed near collapse. Many enlistments were about to expire at year's end, and without fresh victory, the army might simply dissolve. Washington recognized the urgency. He devised a bold plan, one final gamble to rekindle hope. On Christmas night, as snow fell and icy winds tore across the Delaware River, Washington led 2,400 men in small boats across the freezing current. The river was choked with ice floes, the wind howled against their cloaks, and soldiers clutched their muskets with frozen hands. Yet they pressed on, ferried by grim determination. Arriving on the far shore before dawn, the ragged army marched 9 miles through snow and sleet to the small town of Trenton, where a Hessian garrison lay unsuspecting. At sunrise, Washington gave the order to attack. Muskets cracked, cannon fire echoed, and within an hour the stunned Hessians surrendered. The victory at Trenton electrified the colonies. After months of retreat and despair, the revolution had struck back. Washington's daring had changed the story, proving that the army and the cause of independence still lived. Rushing icy river water, rattling of oars, distant roll of drums rising with the dawn, sudden clash of musket fire fading into triumphant cheers. The road to Princeton. The triumph at Trenton was only the beginning. Days later, Washington struck again. With British reinforcements marching toward him, he slipped away in the night and attacked their rear at Princeton. Once more, his army triumphed, scattering the enemy and seizing another unlikely victory. At Princeton, Washington himself rode into the thick of battle. His officers begged him to fall back, but he pressed forward, rallying troops who were wavering under heavy fire. His tall figure on horseback, unshaken in the storm of musket balls, became a living symbol of the revolution's endurance. Soldiers who moments earlier thought of retreat surged forward, inspired by the sight of their commander's calm courage. The back-to-back victories of Trenton and Princeton turned the tide. They did not end the war, but they revived a cause that had nearly bled out. Congress returned to Philadelphia. Enlistments rose, and across the Atlantic, European powers began to take notice. Galloping hooves, clash of steel, followed by the distant ringing of a church bell at dawn, a sound of hope returning. Trials of leadership. Even in the wake of these triumphs, Washington's trials did not vanish. The army remained underfed, underpaid, and constantly on the brink of dissolution. Rivalries among officers, criticism from Congress, and the endless struggle of supply chains weighed on him. Yet through each burden, Washington's central strength was not brilliance in tactics alone, but steadfastness. He was not immune to doubt. His private writings reveal a man deeply aware of his own limits, but he never allowed despair to fracture his outward composure. He understood that his very presence was a kind of glue holding together the fragile unity of a nation in its infancy. And so, in those early years of the Revolution, Washington's legacy began to take shape, not in glorious triumphs alone, but in the ability to endure, to stand firm when the winds of defeat howled strongest. Crackling of a campfire, hushed voices of soldiers singing faintly in the cold night, a reminder of endurance amid uncertainty. Winter at Valley Forge. Script: The winter of 1777 descended slowly upon Pennsylvania, carrying with it a stillness that would come to define one of the most remembered episodes in the story of George Washington and the American Revolution. By late December, the ragged Continental Army marched toward a place few had heard of, Valley Forge, a quiet expanse of fields and wooded hills some 20 miles from Philadelphia. To many of the men, it seemed an unlikely sanctuary. Yet within these bleak surroundings, Washington's leadership would be tested in a way more profound than in any battle fought upon the field. The march itself was grim. Soldiers trudged with bare or broken shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Their coats, if they had them at all, were threadbare. Many had gone days with little to eat, but fire cakes, simple cakes of flour and water cooked on hot stones. They were an army in name more than appearance, and yet, at the center of it all, George Washington rode upon his horse with his usual quiet dignity. His figure was weary but steady, a symbol of endurance when hope flickered low. Washington had chosen Valley Forge for its strategic position. It lay far enough from the British-occupied city of Philadelphia to avoid sudden attack, yet close enough to watch and contain the enemy. But strategy offered little comfort to men who shivered beneath makeshift blankets. What they saw instead were endless weeks of hardship ahead, and many quietly wondered if they could endure. Ambient sound cue. Distant cold wind whistling through trees, faint crunch of footsteps in snow, crackle of a struggling fire. The first task was survival. The men set to work building huts, small, log-walled shelters roofed with thatch and mud. It was slow labor, and the icy winds cut mercilessly against exposed hands. The soldiers felled trees, not only for construction but for firewood, which became as precious as bread. Day by day, a village of rough cabins rose from the frozen ground, transforming the open fields into a makeshift military town. Washington himself moved among the men often, not simply issuing orders but showing his presence. He inspected the huts, spoke to the weary soldiers, and shared in their discomfort. He understood that his role was not only as commander but as a steadying figure, one whose mere presence could kindle courage. Yet in his private letters, he revealed the burden he carried. To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, he wrote, is a situation not to be envied. Food was scarce. Supply wagons arrived infrequently, and when they did, the contents were meager. Meat was often spoiled, bread infested with worms, and rations so small that hunger gnawed at every belly. Some men foraged in the woods for roots and wild greens, while others begged from nearby farmers. Washington pressed Congress repeatedly for better provisions, but the young government was slow. Its resources stretched thin. The army suffered, and Washington knew morale could break if left untended. Ambient sound. Cue. Low crackling fire, distant howl of wind, muffled coughs, and shuffling in wooden cabins. The suffering was not only physical but emotional. Disease stalked the camp relentlessly. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread among the soldiers, claiming thousands of lives over the long winter. Each day brought funerals, the ground at Valley Forge slowly filling with graves. For those who remained, the losses were a daily reminder of their fragility. Yet, Washington held firm. He wrote letters that carried both urgency and resolve. He pressed not only Congress but local officials, seeking food, clothing, and medicine for his men. He appealed to governors, merchants, and civilians alike, reminding them that without the army, the cause of liberty itself would perish. His tone was measured but relentless. This balance, a calm exterior masking the desperation beneath, defined his leadership through those bleak months. And gradually, his efforts bore fruit. Supplies began to trickle in, enough to sustain the army, though never in abundance. More importantly, a new figure arrived at Valley Forge who would change the very spirit of the army. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian officer of remarkable discipline and energy. Von Steuben came not with riches or supplies, but with knowledge of how to train an army. Where the soldiers of Washington's force were brave yet disorderly, von Steuben instilled precision and order. He drilled the men daily, teaching them how to march, maneuver, and fight as a unified body. At first, the soldiers grumbled at the rigor of the drills, but over time they recognized the transformation within themselves. They were no longer a band of scattered volunteers, but an army that could stand against Britain's best. Washington watched this transformation closely. He supported von Steuben, and by spring, he saw before him a force that was hardened by both suffering and training. The winter had carved endurance into their bones, and von Steuben's discipline had given them new strength. Ambient sound cue, rhythmic stomping of boots in unison, shouted commands in German-accented English, the metallic clink of muskets drilled in precision. Washington's leadership throughout the Valley Forge ordeal was marked by restraint. He did not rally his men with fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, he offered constancy. He endured what they endured, sharing their hunger, their cold, and their grief. In doing so, he won not only their obedience but their loyalty. The soldiers saw in him a leader who bore the weight of command not as privilege, but as burden. Meanwhile, outside the camp, whispers of doubt spread. Some in Congress questioned Washington's leadership, even considering replacing him. Yet, within Valley Forge, his soldiers grew more devoted. This bond between commander and army became one of the Revolution's strongest foundations. By the time spring arrived, the once wretched camp had become the birthplace of a stronger army. The hardships of Valley Forge had not destroyed them. Rather, they had forged them into something new. Washington, too, emerged from that winter not with triumph or conquest, but with the quiet victory of survival and transformation. The Revolution, fragile as it was, had endured another trial, and with it, the hope of liberty continued to burn. Ambient sound cue. Birds returning in spring, soft rustle of new leaves, a distant drumbeat signaling renewed strength, and gradually, his efforts bore fruit. Supplies began to trickle in, enough to sustain the army, though never in abundance. More importantly, a new figure arrived at Valley Forge who would change the very spirit of the army. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian officer of remarkable discipline and energy. Von Steuben came not with riches or supplies, but with knowledge of how to train an army. Where the soldiers of Washington's force were brave yet disorderly, von Steuben instilled precision and order. He drilled the men daily, teaching them how to march, maneuver, and fight as a unified body. At first, the soldiers grumbled at the rigor of the drills, but over time they recognized the transformation within themselves. They were no longer a band of scattered volunteers, but an army that could stand against Britain's best. Washington watched this transformation closely. He supported von Steuben, and by spring, he saw before him a force that was hardened by both suffering and training. The winter had carved endurance into their bones, and von Steuben's discipline had given them new strength. Ambient sound cue, rhythmic stomping of boots in unison, shouted commands in German-accented English, the metallic clink of muskets drilled in precision. Washington's leadership throughout the Valley Forge ordeal was marked by restraint. He did not rally his men with fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, he offered constancy. He endured what they endured, sharing their hunger, their cold, and their grief. In doing so, he won not only their obedience but their loyalty. The soldiers saw in him a leader who bore the weight of command not as privilege, but as burden. Meanwhile, outside the camp, whispers of doubt spread. Some in Congress questioned Washington's leadership, even considering replacing him. Yet, within Valley Forge, his soldiers grew more devoted. This bond between commander and army became one of the Revolution's strongest foundations. By the time spring arrived, the once wretched camp had become the birthplace of a stronger army. The hardships of Valley Forge had not destroyed them. Rather, they had forged them into something new. Washington, too, emerged from that winter not with triumph or conquest, but with the quiet victory of survival and transformation. The revolution, fragile as it was, had endured another trial, and with it, the hope of liberty continued to burn. Ambient sound cue. Birds returning in spring, soft rustle of new leaves, a distant drumbeat signaling renewed strength. Turning the tide. The alliance with France. The winter of 1778 settled gently over the colonies, but unlike the darkness and despair of Valley Forge, a new mood now lingered on the horizon. The Continental Army, hardened by cold, hunger, and endless trial, stood under Washington's steady gaze. They had endured so much, yet a glimmer of hope was beginning to warm the chill of war. This hope did not come from a battlefield, but from far across the ocean, in the glittering halls of Versailles and the salons of Paris. For years, Washington and the Continental Congress had quietly wished for allies. Alone, the fledgling American nation faced one of the most formidable powers on earth, the British Empire. Their troops were trained, disciplined, and supplied. Their navy ruled the seas. Against such strength, America's survival seemed unlikely. Washington understood this deeply. From the earliest days of the Revolution, he had pressed the Congress and diplomats to seek aid, particularly from France. The French, after all, had long held grievances against Britain after their defeat in the 7 Years' War. If ever there was a people who might wish to see Britain humbled, it was them. The long path to alliance. Yet persuading France was no simple matter. For all their resentment of Britain, the French court was cautious. They watched as the colonies struggled in battle. They observed defeats and retreats, wondering whether this rebellion was merely a passing disturbance. Would these Americans truly endure, or would they collapse at the first sign of prolonged hardship? The answer came slowly, shaped by Washington's perseverance and the sacrifices of his men. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777, fought under the command of General Horatio Gates, gave the French what they needed: proof that America could win. The surrender of General Burgoyne's army shocked Britain and thrilled the revolutionaries. More importantly, it convinced France that America was no mere rebellion. It was a cause with promise. As the French court pondered, one man worked tirelessly to turn sympathy into commitment: Benjamin Franklin. At 70 years old, Franklin was already a figure of legend. His wisdom, wit, and charm won over the salons of Paris. He wore his simple fur hat and plain coats, embracing the image of a humble American sage, a stark contrast to the powdered wigs and silks of the French aristocracy. In truth, it was deliberate. Franklin knew the power of symbols. To the French, he became a living emblem of the American struggle, honest, simple, and virtuous. Washington awaits word. In camp, Washington could only wait. Diplomacy was far beyond his reach, and yet its consequences would determine the survival of his army. Supplies remained scarce. Morale was fragile. Each letter from Franklin in Paris carried immense weight, and Washington read them with the patience of a man who had learned to expect both disappointment and delay. By early 1778, the waiting came to an end. News arrived. France had formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. More than that, they had signed treaties of alliance and commerce. French ships would soon sail to American shores. Their soldiers and sailors would fight alongside Washington's weary men. For the first time, the tide of war began to shift. Imagine the relief Washington must have felt, though outwardly, as always, he remained measured. He understood that the alliance was not a victory in itself, but it was the foundation upon which future victories could be built. For the men around him, however, the news spread like fire through dry grass. Bells rang, cheers filled the air, and for the first time in many months, the thought of triumph did not feel distant. The arrival of French aid. By the summer of 1778, French ships crossed the Atlantic. Their sails, adorned with the fleur-de-lis, gleamed against the horizon. To the Continental Army, exhausted and often barefoot, the sight must have seemed almost dreamlike. Supplies flowed more steadily: muskets, powder, uniforms, and provisions. Perhaps most importantly, the French Navy entered the conflict. No longer would Britain's ships sail unchallenged along American coasts. Washington welcomed French commanders with dignity and respect. He recognized the delicate balance that must be maintained. The French were allies, but they were also a proud power, eager to play their part with honor. There were moments of difficulty, clashes of language, culture, and pride. But Washington's leadership helped bridge these gaps. He treated the alliance not as a gift, but as a partnership. He knew that America's independence depended on it. A new confidence. The psychological effect of the French alliance was immense. Soldiers who had once wondered whether their suffering was in vain now felt part of something larger. The revolution was no longer the lonely struggle of 13 colonies. It was a cause embraced by nations. The French commitment also encouraged Spain and the Dutch Republic to edge closer to aiding the Americans. The world was beginning to see the revolution not as a rebellion, but as a war for independence with global consequences. Washington, however, remained steady. He knew that enthusiasm could lead to recklessness. The war was not yet won. But as he walked through the camps and looked upon the soldiers who had endured years of deprivation, he saw something new in their eyes: belief, calm before the storm. The months following the alliance were a time of cautious optimism. The British, stunned by France's decision, began to rethink their strategies. No longer fighting a colonial uprising, they now faced a global conflict. The balance of power had shifted, and Washington's army, though still fragile, was no longer alone. In his tent at night, perhaps by candlelight, Washington would reflect upon how far they had come. From the desperate retreats of 1776, through the freezing nights of Valley Forge, to this moment when the greatest kingdom in Europe had chosen to stand beside them, what a journey it had been. And yet, Washington knew the hardest trials were still ahead. Victory was not guaranteed, but for the first time, it seemed possible. The revolution, once a fragile flame, was now fanned by the winds of alliance. The road to Yorktown. Victory sealed script. The revolution had endured long years of hardship, wavering morale, and uncertain fortunes. Yet by the early 1780s, the tide of war was shifting in favor of the American cause. George Washington, though wearied by the burdens of leadership, carried within him the steady determination that had held the fragile coalition together. His greatest test still lay ahead, for the British were not yet broken. But with the support of France and the patience of his army, the path toward final victory was beginning to take form. A long war's toll. By 1780, the Continental Army was thinly stretched. Supplies were scarce, uniforms were worn through, and desertion was not uncommon. Washington, writing to Congress, lamented the state of his men. "We are at the end of our tether. Without fresh support, I cannot answer for consequences." Yet in the midst of hardship, he continued to inspire loyalty. Soldiers, seeing their general share their meager rations, found cause to endure a little longer. Washington's quiet presence in camp, his calm demeanor, and his refusal to despair became the lifeline of the revolution. The entry of France into the war, secured 2 years earlier, began to bear fruit. Ships sailed from French ports, bringing powder, muskets, and trained officers. Slowly, Washington's army found new life. But the struggle was far from over, and the British still controlled strongholds, particularly New York and the South. The war's final act would unfold in a way few could have foreseen. The British shift south. Frustrated by stalemate in the northern colonies, Britain turned its attention southward. Lord Cornwallis marched his forces through the Carolinas and into Virginia, seeking to cut off American supply lines and rally Loyalist support. Battles at Camden, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse tested both sides. Though the British won some encounters, the cost was heavy, and American resilience, aided by skilled commanders like Nathaniel Greene, wore them down. Cornwallis sought a base where he could regroup and resupply. He chose the small port town of Yorktown, Virginia, situated along the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, monitoring the British movements, saw an opportunity. Yet, he knew that seizing it would require perfect timing and cooperation with America's French allies. Deception and decision. Through the spring and summer of 1781, Washington remained near New York, keeping watch on British General Clinton's army. To observers, it seemed his aim was still to attack New York City, the heart of British power in America. But in secret, plans were forming. Word arrived that Admiral de Grasse, leading the French fleet, intended to sail into the Chesapeake. If Washington could march his forces south, linking with the French, they could trap Cornwallis by land and sea. Washington faced a crucial choice. His army, weary and underfed, would have to undertake a forced march of hundreds of miles. Supplies would be needed, secrecy would be vital, and speed essential. At last, he made his decision. The strike would fall not on New York, but Yorktown. The Grand March. In August of 1781, Washington's troops quietly left their positions around New York. To deceive the British, campfires were kept burning, patrols marched as usual, and false rumors were spread. Then, under the cover of secrecy, the Continental Army, joined by French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau, began their march southward. It was an extraordinary sight. Thousands of soldiers in worn uniforms, boots falling apart, marched alongside fresh French regiments in their white coats, trimmed with blue and gold. Wagons creaked, cannons rolled, and fifes played faint tunes to keep the men's spirits alive. Along the dusty roads, townsfolk cheered, offering bread, apples, and encouragement. Washington rode at the head, solemn yet resolute. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, for he knew this campaign might decide the fate of the Revolution. Yorktown encircled. By September, the combined forces arrived in Virginia. Cornwallis had fortified Yorktown, believing the British Navy would soon bring reinforcements. But the unexpected unfolded. Off the coast, Admiral de Grasse met the British fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake. In a clash of cannons and sails, the French drove the British away. For the first time, Britain had lost command of the sea in American waters. Cornwallis, cut off by water, now faced the advancing armies of Washington and Rochambeau by land. The siege began. Trenches were dug, cannon emplacements built, and the ring around Yorktown tightened. Washington himself directed the placement of heavy guns. Night after night, American and French soldiers worked under the glow of lanterns, digging closer to the British defenses. By early October, the thunder of artillery shook the town. British walls crumbled, and morale inside Yorktown sank. Washington's moment. On October 14th, American and French troops launched an assault on two key British redoubts. Alexander Hamilton, then a young officer seeking command, led one of the storming parties. With bayonets fixed and drums beating, the men rushed forward, overwhelming the defenses. The redoubts fell, and Cornwallis's position became untenable. Washington, watching the progress from the siege lines, allowed himself rare relief. For years, he had endured setbacks, doubts, and near collapse. Now the end was in sight. Cornwallis attempted a desperate escape across the river, but was driven back by storms. At last, with no options left, he sought terms of surrender. The surrender at Yorktown. On October 19th, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown. Drums played a slow, somber beat, and muskets were stacked in surrender. Washington, maintaining dignity, refused to accept the surrender directly from Cornwallis, who feigned illness. Instead, Cornwallis's deputy offered his sword to Washington's representative, General Benjamin Lincoln. The scene was solemn, yet profound. The war was not formally ended. The British still held New York, and negotiations would continue for 2 more years. But Yorktown had broken Britain's will to fight. The American cause had prevailed. Reflection. As church bells rang in celebration across the colonies, Washington remained calm. He cautioned against overconfidence, reminding his men that discipline must be maintained until peace was secured. Yet in private, he allowed himself to breathe. The burden he had carried for so long, the weight of an entire nation's hopes, had at last found release. The victory at Yorktown was not just a triumph of arms, but of endurance, alliance, and Washington's unwavering resolve. Against the mightiest empire of the age, the united efforts of farmers, laborers, soldiers, and statesmen had forged a new destiny. And Washington, standing at the heart of it, became the symbol of that triumph. Legacy of the first president. The revolution had been won. The fledgling republic had survived its infancy. And George Washington, the man who had led armies and held the nation's fragile unity together, now faced his most enduring test, stepping into history not as a general, but as the first president of the United States. The spring of 1789 brought a new dawn. In New York City, the temporary capital, citizens crowded the streets, craning their necks to glimpse the man who had become almost mythical in stature. They saw not a king, nor a monarch with jeweled robes, but a tall, reserved figure in plain attire, humbled by the burden of expectation. On April 30th, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, George Washington placed his hand upon the Bible and took the oath of office. The crowd erupted in cheers, and church bells rang across the city. The moment was solemn, yet filled with cautious hope. America, an experiment in liberty, had chosen its leader not by birthright, but by the will of its people. Washington entered the presidency not with grandeur, but with reluctance. He had longed to retire to Mount Vernon, to the fields and trees of Virginia. Yet duty called once again. His vision was not to seize power, but to define its limits. For he knew that every action, every word, would set a precedent for generations to come. How should a president address Congress? How should foreign ambassadors be received? Should he be called Your Excellency or simply Mr. President? In each of these choices, Washington shaped the unwritten rules of a new democracy. Faint sound of quills scratching on parchment, muffled chatter in a candlelit hall, soft rustle of fabric. The challenges were immense. The treasury was nearly empty, debts weighed heavily on the new republic, and regional divisions threatened to splinter unity. Washington turned to trusted figures like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Though their rivalries would grow fierce, Washington's steady hand kept the cabinet from tearing apart the nation in its infancy. He valued debate, but prized unity above all. At home, farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelled against a federal whiskey tax, and Washington, though reluctant, marched at the head of troops to enforce the law. His very presence was enough to quell the unrest without battle. Abroad, the world watched closely. Would America remain neutral in the fierce wars of Europe? Washington, cautious yet firm, declared neutrality, believing the nation too fragile to be drawn into foreign conflicts. His decision was unpopular in some circles but proved vital in securing stability. Ambient cue, distant toll of church bells, muffled thunder rolling across wide skies, calming hush of wind through trees. Through it all, Washington longed for simplicity. He rode through the countryside, corresponded with citizens, and held gatherings at his residence. Yet he was ever aware of the weight of his office. He refused to let power cling to him. After 2 terms, when many urged him to continue, he chose instead to step away, to surrender authority willingly, something rare in history. His farewell address warned against political factions, foreign entanglements, and the dangers of disunity. His words echoed like scripture for the Republic. When he returned to Mount Vernon at last, Washington believed he had done his duty. He sought peace in his final years, walking among his fields, hosting visitors, reflecting on the experiment he had helped to guide. On December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away at his home. Bells tolled across the nation. Mourning draped the land. He was remembered not merely as a victorious general, nor solely as the first president, but as a man who embodied restraint, virtue, and the quiet strength of character upon which a republic could stand. In death, as in life, Washington became a symbol. His name adorned towns, counties, schools, and eventually the capital of the nation itself. His image carved into monuments, his legacy etched into the conscience of a people striving to live up to the promise he had helped to shape. The story of George Washington is not one of flawless perfection, but of enduring example. He had doubts, he struggled with burdens, he made choices that were at times controversial. Yet through it all, he placed the good of the nation above his own ambition. And in that, he left behind not only a new country, but also a new idea, that leadership could be humble, that power could be relinquished, and that freedom could be preserved through virtue and restraint. And so, the man who once crossed the Delaware, who stood firm at Valley Forge, who united a fledgling people in times of despair, continues to stand, not in flesh, but in spirit. His legacy whispers through the halls of government, through the voices of teachers and storytellers, through the quiet strength of citizens who believe in the promise of liberty. Ambient cue, soft breeze rustling autumn leaves, distant fire crackling, gentle sound of flowing river. In the end, George Washington's greatest triumph was not victory in battle, but the gift of example, the silent, steadfast guidance of a man who chose principle over power, and in doing so became the father of his country.